If you were working class in Victorian London, you were likely to spend most of the money you earned on rent, but the standard of accommodation you could afford was likely to be squalid, if you could afford it at all. This wasn't a time when tenants had any kind of legal protection for basic housing standards, and for unscrupulous landlords, the only incentive that they had was to pile up rooms with as many people as possible and collect their money. If you had holes in your walls and roof, broken doors, or infestation, your landlord, more often than not, couldn't care less. You'd be told that it was cheap, and if you didn't want it, someone else would. Your only remedy was to move out. But if you were poor, you were already struggling to pay the rent money on the hovel you were suffering to endure, could afford nothing better, and had nowhere else to go, other than the streets or the workhouse. Poor housing was a magnet for transients and criminals. Tenants could well be involved in all sorts of illegal activity. They might be known to the police for theft or assault, but even their slum landlords carried on illegal rackets, such as controlling prostitutes, fencing stolen goods, and arranging prize fights, hidden behind the screen of renting out property as a legitimate business. Two of the more infamous landlords in the East End underworld were Jack McCarthy and William Crossingham, who carried on these crimes in the same streets that the notorious Jack the Ripper stalked in the late 1880s. That's not to say that there weren't landlords who cared about their property and the lives of their tenants, but positive change was a slow process, and not only for improving the standard of accommodation. Tenants instinctively mistrusted landlords and had to be given a reason to invest their own effort to caring for the appearance of a neighbourhood through self-reliant maintenance. One such landlady who documented her efforts to improve this situation was Octavia Hill, when she became landlady of several dwellings in a poor area of West London. Hill was a social reformer who took a keen interest in bettering the lives of London's poor and did much to bring about social housing. Distressed by the indifference of landlords to the state of housing and the failure of legislation to protect the interest of the poorest members of society, she became a landlady herself. She took a personal interest in collecting rent and the welfare of tenants, reinvesting money into building improvements. One way she brought about change was going above and beyond being concerned only with money. A story is recorded of how one of her tenants was given notice to quit, not because he was behind on the rent, but because he had overcrowded his rooms and would not send his children to school. Whilst this is more like being a social worker than what we would expect from a landlord today, she had the power and used it, and it worked. You will hear, in an account by Octavia Hill, about the wretched state of the housing in Marylebone, London, for which, in 1869, she became responsible, and the desperate lives of the inhabitants she found in these slum houses, which she named a court, in preference to the ugliness of the former word. Learn how she set about improving the state of housing and, ultimately, the suffering of her poor tenants. Before we move on, please consider clicking the subscribe button for more content like this. If you find this video interesting, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up and share it widely with friends and family. Please check out the description to see how you can support the channel and the content we make. Three ladies were standing not long ago in a poor and dingy court in London, when a group of dirty-faced urchins exclaimed, in a tone partly of impudence and partly of fun, "What a lot of landladies this morning!" The word set me thinking, for I felt that the boys' mirth was excited not only by the number of landladies, or of ladies acting as such, but also probably by the contrast between these ladies and the landladies they usually saw. For the landlady to the London poor is too often a struggling, cheated, much worried, long-suffering woman, soured by constant dealing with untrustworthy people, embittered by loss, a prey to the worst lodgers whom she allows to fall into debt, and is afraid to turn out, lest she should lose the amount they owe her, without spirit or education to enable her to devise improvements, or capital to execute them, never able, in short, to use the power given her by her position, to bring order into the lives of her tenants, being, indeed too frequently, entirely under their control. There is a numerous class of landladies worse even than this: bullying, violent, passionate, revengeful, and cowardly. They alternately cajole and threaten, but rarely intend to carry out either their promises or their threats. Severe without principle, weakly indulgent towards evil, given to lying and swearing, too covetous to be drunken, yet indulgent to any lodger who will treat them. Their influence is incalculably mischievous. It was near the end of 1869 that I first heard that a good many houses in Blank Court were to be disposed of. Eventually, in the course of that year, 6 10-roomed houses were bought by the Countess of Duchy, and 5 more by another lady, and placed partially under my care. I was especially glad to obtain some influence here, as I knew this place to be one of the worst in Marylebone. Its inhabitants were mainly costermongers and small hawkers, and were almost the poorest class of those amongst our population who have any settled home, the next grade below them being vagrants who sleep in common lodging-houses, and I knew that its moral standing was equally low. Its reputation had long been familiar to me, for when unruly and hopeless tenants were sent away from other houses in the district, I had often heard that they had gone to Blank Court, the tone in which it was said implying that they had now sunk to the lowest depths of degradation. A lawyer friend had also said to me, on hearing that it was proposed to buy houses there, "Blank Court? Why, that is the place one is always noticing in the police reports for its rows." Yet its outward appearance would not have led a casual observer to guess its real character. Blank Court is not far from Cavendish Square, and daily in the season scores of carriages, with their gaily dressed occupants, pass the end of it. Should such look down it, they would little divine its inner life. Seen from the outside, and in the daytime, it is a quiet-looking place, the houses a moderate size, and the space between them tolerably wide. It has no roadway, but is nicely enough paved, and old furniture stands out for sale on the pavement, in front of the few shops. But if anyone had entered those houses with me 2 years ago, he would have seen enough to surprise and horrify him. In many of the houses, the dust-bins were utterly unapproachable, and cabbage leaves, stale fish, and every sort of dirt were lying in the passages and on the stairs. In some, the back kitchen had been used as a dust-bin, but had not been emptied for years, and the dust filtered through into the front kitchens, which were the sole living and sleeping rooms of some families. In some, the kitchen stairs were many inches thick with dirt, which was so hardened that a shovel had to be used to get it off. In some, there was hardly any water to be had. The wood was eaten away and broken away, windows were smashed, and the rain was coming through the roofs. At night it was still worse, and during the winter I had to collect the rents chiefly then, as the inhabitants, being principally costermongers, were out nearly all day, and they were afraid to entrust their rent to their neighbours. It was then that I saw the houses in their most dreadful aspect. I well remember wet, foggy Monday nights when I turned down the dingy court, past the brilliantly lighted public house at the corner, past the old furniture outside the shops, and dived into the dark, yawning passageways. The front doors stood open day and night, and as I felt my way down the kitchen stairs, broken and rounded by the hardened mud upon them, the foul smells which the heavy, foggy air would not allow to rise met me as I descended, and the plaster rattled down with a hollow sound as I groped along. It was truly appalling to think that there were human beings who lived habitually in such an atmosphere, with such surroundings. Sometimes I had to open the kitchen door myself, after knocking several times in vain, when a woman, quite drunk, would be lying on the floor on some black mass which served as a bed. Sometimes, in answer to my knocks, a half-drunken man would swear and thrust the rent money out to me through a chink in the door, placing his foot against it, so as to prevent it from opening wide enough to admit me. Always it would be shut again without a light being offered to guide me up the pitch-dark stairs. Such was Blank Court in the winter of 1869. Truly a wild, lawless, desolate little kingdom to come to rule over. Our first step on obtaining possession was to call on all the inhabitants to establish our claim to receive rents. We accepted or refused the people as tenants, made their acquaintance, and learnt all they might be disposed to tell us about themselves and their families. We came upon strange scenes sometimes. In one room, a handsome, black-tangled-haired, ragged boy and girl of about 9 and 10, with wild dark eyes, were always to be found, sometimes squatting near the fire, watching a great black pot, sometimes amusing themselves with cutting paper into strips with scissors. It was difficult to extract a word. The money and dirty rent book were generally pushed to us in silence. No grown person was ever to be seen. For months I never saw these children in the open air. Often they would lie in bed all day long, and I believe they were too ignorant and indolent to care to leave the house, except at night, when the boy, as we afterwards found, would creep like a cat along the roofs of the outbuildings to steal lumps of coal from a neighbouring shed. At one room we had to call again and again, always finding the door locked. At last, after weeks of vain effort, I found the woman who owned the room at home. She was sitting on the floor at tea with another woman, the tea being served on an inverted hamper. I sat down on the opposite hamper, which was the only other piece of furniture in the room, and told her I was sorry that I had never been able to make her acquaintance before, to which she replied, with a rather grand air and merry twinkle in her eye, that she had been unavoidably absent. In other words, some weeks in prison, not a rare occurrence for her. When we set about our repairs and alterations, there was much that was discouraging. The better class of people in the court were hopeless of any permanent improvement. When one of the tenants of the shop saw that we were sending workmen into the empty rooms, he said considerately, "I'll tell you what it is, miss. It'll cost you a lot of money to repair them places, and it's no good. The women's heads will be drove through those door panels again in no time, and the place is good enough for such cattle as them there." But we were not to be deterred. On the other hand, we were not to be hurried in our action by threats. These were not wanting, for no sooner did the tenants see the workmen about than they seemed to think that if they only clamoured enough, they would get their own rooms put to rights. Nothing had been done for years. Now, they thought, was their opportunity. More than one woman locked me in her room with her, the better to rave and storm. She would shake the rent in her pocket to tempt me with the sound of the money, and roar out that never a farthing of it would she pay till her grate was set, or her floor was mended, as the case might be. Perfect silence would make her voice drop, lower and lower, until at last she would stop, wondering that no violent answers were hurled back at her, and a pause would ensue. I felt that promises would be little believed in, and, besides, I wished to feel free to do as much, and only as much, as seemed best to me, so that my plan was to trust to my deeds to speak for themselves, and inspire confidence as time went on. In such a pause, therefore, I once said to a handsome Irish woman, "How long have you lived here?" "More than 4 years," she replied, her voice swelling again at the remembrance of her wrongs. "And always was a good tenant, and paid me way, and never a thing done, and to be great," etc., etc., etc. "And how long have you had the houses?" "Well, I suppose since Monday week." In a gruff but somewhat mollified tone, "Very well, Mrs. L. Just think over quietly what has been done in the houses since then, and if you like to leave and think you can suit yourself better, I am glad you should make yourself comfortable. Meanwhile, of course, while you stay, you pay rent. I will call for it this evening if it doesn't suit you to pay now. Good morning." Almost immediately after the purchase of the houses, we had the accumulated refuse of years carted away. The pavement in the yards and front areas were repaired, dustbins cleared, the drains put in order, and water supplied. Such improvements as these are tolerably unspoilable, but for any of a more destructible nature it was better to wait. The importance of advancing slowly and of gaining some hold over the people as a necessary accompaniment to any real improvement in their dwellings was perpetually apparent. These habits were so degraded that we had to work a change in these before they would make any proper use of the improved surroundings we were prepared to give them. We had locks torn off, windows broken, drains stopped, dustbins misused in every possible manner, even pipes broken, and water taps wrenched away. This was sometimes the result of carelessness and deeply rooted habit of dirt and untidiness. Sometimes the damage was willful. Our remedy was to watch for the right moment for furnishing these appliances, to persevere in supplying them, and to get the people by degrees to work with us for their preservation. I have learned to know that people are ashamed to abuse a place they find cared for. They will add dirt to dirt till a place is pestilential, but the more they find done for it, the more they will respect it, till at last order and cleanliness prevail. Our plan of removing the inhabitants of the miserable underground kitchens to rooms in the upper parts of the houses did not, strange as it may seem, meet with any approbation at first. They had been so long in the semi-darkness that they felt it an effort to move. One woman, in particular, I remember pleaded hard with me to let her stop, saying, "More bits of things won't look anything if you bring them to the light." By degrees, however, we effected the change. Our custom was to use necessary, yet not immediately wanted repairs as a means of affording work to the tenants in slack times. I lay great stress upon this. Though the men are not mechanics, there are many rough jobs of plastering, distempering, glazing, or sweeping away and removing rubbish, which they can do. When, therefore, a tenant is out of work, instead of reducing his energy by any gifts of money, we simply, whenever the funds at our disposal allow it, employ him in restoring and purifying the houses. And what a difference 5 shillings worth of work in a bad week will make to a family! The father, instead of idling listlessly at the corner of the street, sets busily and happily to work, prepares the whitewash, mends the plaster, distempers the room. The wife bethinks herself of having a turn out of musty corners or drawers, untouched maybe for months, of cleaning her windows, perhaps even of putting up a clean blind, and thus a sense of decency. The hope of beginning afresh and doing better comes like new life into the home. The same cheering and encouraging sort of influence, though in a less degree, is exercised by our plan of having a little band of scrubbers. We have each passage scrubbed twice a week by one of the elder girls. The 6pence thus earned is a stimulus, and they often take an extreme interest in the work itself. One little girl was so proud of her first cleaning that she stood for 2 hours watching her passage, lest the boys, whom she considered as the natural enemies of order and cleanliness, should spoil it before I came to see it. And one woman remarked to her neighbour how nice the stairs looked. "They haven't been cleaned," she added, "since ever I came into this house." She had been there 6 years. The effect of these clean passages frequently spreads to the rooms, as the dark line of demarcation between the cleaned passage and the still dirty room arouses the attention and begins to trouble the minds of its inmates. Gradually, then, these various modes of dealing with our little realm began to tell. Gradually, the people began to trust us, and gradually the houses were improved. The sense of quiet power and sympathy soon made itself felt, and less was there any sign of rudeness or violence towards ourselves. Even before the first winter was over, many a one would hurry to light us up the stairs, and instead of my having the rent book and money thrust to me through the half-open door, and being kept from possible entrance by a firmly planted foot, my reception would be, "Oh, can't you come in, miss, and sit down for a bit?" Little by little, the houses were renovated, the grates reset, the holes in the floors repaired,
the cracking, dirty plaster replaced by a clean, smooth surface, the heaps of rubbish removed, and we progressed towards order. Since we began our work in the court, there has been a marked improvement in many of the people. I may just say, as examples, that the passionate Irish tenant who locked me into her room did not leave us, but has settled down happily, and has shown me more than one act of confidence and kindly feeling. That the old woman whose bits of things would look nothing if brought upstairs, after having been long in a light room, has now asked for a larger one, having freed herself from a debt which cramped her resources, and has begun to save, and that the two dark-eyed children were ultimately won over to trust us. Their mother, a most degraded woman, when she at last appeared, proved to be living a very disreputable life, and the only hope for the children was to get them away from her influence. My first triumph was in getting the girl to exert herself enough to become one of our scrubbers, and finally, a year ago, we were able to persuade her to go to a little industrial school in the country, where she has since been joined by a sister of hers, who turned up subsequently to my first visits. Unfortunately, the mother absconded, taking the boy with her, while we were still hoping to get him sent away to a training school also. But even in the short time that he remained with us, I had got some hold over him, by dint of making an agreement with him that I would myself fetch him at 8 one morning and help him to prepare his toilet so as to be fit for the nearest ragged school. I got him to begin learning, and when once the ice was broken, he went frequently of his own accord. Opportunities for helping people at some important crisis of their lives not infrequently present themselves. For instance, soon after we came into possession of Blank Court, I once or twice received rent from a young girl, whom I generally found sitting sadly in a nearly bare room, holding in her arms a little baby. She looked so young that I thought at first the baby must be her sister, but it turned out to be her own child. Her husband seemed a mere boy, and was, in fact, only 19. One day, when the rent was not forthcoming, I learnt their story. It appeared that an aunt had promised the lad a sovereign to set him up as a costermonger, if he married the girl, but he had not bargained for prepayment, and the promise was not fulfilled. This marriage portion, which was to have procured them a stock of herrings, had never been forthcoming. This seemed an occasion upon which a small loan might be of the utmost use. I accordingly lent them the much-needed sovereign, which they have since punctually repaid, and thus saved the young couple from being driven to the workhouse, and gave them a small start in life. There are still depths of evil remaining in Blank Court. It would be impossible for such a place as I described it as being originally to be raised in 2 years to a satisfactory condition. But what I do contend is that we have worked some very real reforms and seen some very real results. I feel that it is in a very great degree a question of time, and that, now that we have got hold of the hearts of the people, the court is sure to improve steadily. It will pay as good a percentage to its owners, and will benefit its tenants as much as any of the other properties under my management have done.